This is a video on the ablative absolute construction. It's one of the most commonly used constructions in the Latin language. You find it a lot at GCSE and even more at A-level. It gives us a chance also to revise, obviously, the case endings of the ablative, as you would imagine. The ablative absolute uses the ablative case a lot, so we're going to be looking at those in this video. And in addition, we're going to be looking at participles, because the ablative absolute construction makes frequent use of participles. In addition to that, I think the ablative absolute is a very beautiful construction, and it involves a very neat trick with words. It's a way of saying a lot in just a few words, so it's worth learning just for the beauty of that. Now let's have a look at some examples. Each of these sentences has an ablative absolute in them, and I'm going to highlight them here. Each time, as you can see, the ablative absolute comes right at the beginning of the sentence. It's the first couple of words, and each time they're separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma. Let's have a look at the words in each ablative absolute. First of all, we have a noun. That's another noun, except in the last example, we've got a pronoun instead, just to be different. After the noun, we have a participle. Laborante is a participle, so is audientibus. Capta is a different sort of participle. It's a PPP, perfect passive participle. Hortato is a different sort again. That's a perfect active one. The last one, just to be different, is it's got a noun after the pronoun. So we'll come to these different sorts as the video goes on. But first of all, let's get some translations down so that we can see what we do with these ablative absolutes in English. Well, for the first one, I'm going to say, when the slave was working. Now, it could be while the slave was working. It could be as the slave was working. Probably best not to translate it as with the slave working. You can do that. It just doesn't sound very natural English. So a when clause is better. When the slave was working. The dogs were sleeping. That's how the sentence ends. Now, let's move on to the next one. And we begin with the citizens, so we'll have when again, but as with the last one, we could say when, while, or as. When the citizens were listening, and then we have the general or the emperor, imperator, you can have either. I'm going to say general. The general spoke. Now the third one is the one that uses a past participle. So I'm going to say when the city had been captured. To make sure that I made it clear that the ablative absolute describes something which has already happened before the next part of the sentence. And here's the next part of the sentence. Everyone, gavicisunt, rejoiced. Presumably they were on the side of the capturers, not the poor people inside the city. Let's look at the next one. When the master, now this is a perfect active participle, so I won't say had been encouraged, but I say had encouraged. One might say after the master encouraged them, perhaps. The slaves worked. And as you know, the last one's a little bit different. And this one will just translate as with you as leader. Literally, it's with you, the leader. I could say when you are leader, but with you as leader is good. I will be happy. Feminine ending on lighter, because this is clearly a woman speaking. So those are some examples, and in the next part of the video we'll have a look at why we translate them like that and what the rules are, so that you can apply those rules to any ablative absolute that you see. So as we noticed, we normally translated them with the word when. Sometimes while will do, if your participle is a present participle, while can be a very good translation. So let's just add there, while for present participle ablative absolutes. As well would work with present participles. They're time-related ideas, which means that they refer to something which happened either during the main event of the sentence or just before it. Now, in the examples which we saw, every ablative absolute was at the beginning of the sentence. That was deliberate on my part for simplicity. And usually that's the case, especially at GCSE, you'll find them at the beginning. And if you see a comma after them, again, that's a very helpful way to identify them. But as you begin to read more complex texts, and certainly if you're reading this as an A-level student, don't be surprised if your ablative absolute is not at the beginning of the sentence. And don't be surprised if there's no handy comma after it. But if you're lucky, you'll get a comma after it, which can help. Well, if you're not relying on the position of the sentence to help you identify it, and you're not relying on the punctuation, then what can you rely on? Well, the typical features of an ablative absolute is that you will, that both the key words in the construction will be in the ablative case. Now, it's normally 2 words in an ablative absolute, of which one will be a participle, the other a noun or a pronoun. But extra words might be added. Now, for participles, the most usual types of ablative absolute are ones which use the present participle, and this ends in ns in the nominative singular, or in all its other cases, it has a stem followed by the letters nt followed by an ending, and it's that nt in the middle by which you normally recognise a present participle. Now, the other sort of participle which is very common in ablative absolutes is the perfect passive participle. These are quite hard to recognise in a group because they have very different formations. Some you will know end in artus, That's, for example, first conjugation verbs have their participle ending in artus. Others might end in etus, but there are other forms as well. If you want to find the perfect passive participle of any verb, then just look in a dictionary or in your vocab list, and it's the 4th principal part. Now, there are other types of participle that might be used in an ablative absolute, and there are also ablative absolutes with no participle at all, and this video will cover those as well. But ablative absolutes most frequently use the present and the perfect passive. Now, you can't master the ablative absolute without getting to grips with the ablative case endings. So here's a table which should look very familiar to you. Here are the first 3 declensions in Latin. Most Latin nouns belong to these, and I'd say that these are the 3 that you absolutely must know. Now, in addition, there are some others. There are 3rd declension nouns, for example, whose ablative ending is an I in the singular instead of an E. There's a 4th declension where the ablative singular ends in U, and there is a 5th declension where it ends in E. Now, if we take all these together and pick out all the singular ablative endings, A, O, E, I, U, we've already seen E, and that means that the noun ablative endings in the singular are always a single vowel, A, E, I, O or U. Never 2 vowels, never ever a consonant, they always end in a single vowel. So those are the singular ablative endings for nouns. What about the plural? Well, the plural always end in the letter S. So we see here abuelis, servis, regibus. In fact, there are 2 endings which are most frequent. There is the IS, which we see there, and the ending ibus. So is and ibus are most frequently found. And in the fifth declension, we can also see the ending abus. So in fact, what we're looking at is either is or bus on the end. Those are our plural ablative endings. It's worth really learning those. As I've said, you should really know this entire table, but in particular, take some time to study the ablative endings. And what about pronouns? As we've seen, ablative absolutes might have a noun with a participle, or they might have a pronoun with a participle. So we need to know our pronouns too. And in fact, if you look at your tables of pronouns, and you can see many of these at the back of your textbook or in your language notes, which we've given you, and you'll see that the pronoun endings mostly model the same endings as nouns have. But some pronouns are a little bit different, and here's one of them, the very commonly used pronoun hic, meaning this or these in the plural. So this one's different to nouns because the ablative, instead of ending with a single vowel, as we've seen before, actually has a C at the end in the singular. So we have hoc, hark, and hoc, and these also are ablative singulars. When it gets to the plural, less surprising perhaps, because there is that is ending which we saw in the nouns. So worth having a look at pronouns as well, especially this one. Now, staying with the focus on the ablative case, let's look at participles, because as you've seen, there are two ingredients in an ablative absolute. One is a noun or a pronoun, and the other word is almost always a participle. Now, participles in Latin might have endings like in this table here, and this upper table is a table for the present participle. It's always active. It's translated as ing in English. So let's just put that in here. And as you see from the table, every form of this, apart from the nominative singular and the vocative singular, has got the letters nt at the beginning of the ending. So you see a verb stem, then you see the letters nt, and after that you see an ending. And when you've got that combination of letters, you know you've got a present participle. Watch out for the ablative case. There is ente in the singular, again ending in the letter E, which we expect to see, and antibus in the plural. The present participle endings, in fact, as I hope you can see from this table, model the endings of the third declension. Now, other participles have an us, a, pattern of endings. That is, they decline just like the adjective bonus, bona, bonum, and all other adjectives like it. If you read the table vertically, you'll see the pattern of endings which is identical to second and first declension nouns. And if you read the table horizontally, I say it should look just like your bonus, bona, bonum, and similar endings. And this table here is the set of endings which you will find on PPPs, that's perfect passive participles, PAPs, that's first perfect active participles. Basically, deponent verbs have these. Deponent verbs don't have perfect passive participles because they don't have passives, so they have PAPs instead. There's a relatively small number of verbs that's got them, so I'm going to put them in brackets. And in fact, you will also find this set of endings on future participles. Future participles end in urus, ura, urum. So again, that us, ending. So if it's not a present participle, it will look like this table here, and the ablative is to be found here. And perhaps it won't surprise you, the singular ablatives are all a single vowel, and the plural ablatives are all IS. So there's a summary here which you can learn. If the word ends in A, E, I, O, U, then chances are you've got an ablative singular. Or turn it round, all ablative singulars will end in A, E, I, O, U, unless they are hoc or huck, from that pronoun we saw earlier. And ablative plurals always end with the letter S. That's a rule that's never broken. Is and ibus are the most common, with bus featuring as well. And there are two exceptions to the ibus or bus rule, which are nobis and vobis, the ablative of the word for us and the ablative of the word for you, plural. And I suppose they do end in is, but I thought I would throw those in as an extra. So what we're going to do now is to translate some ablative absolutes which use present participles. And I've got two examples here for you. Here's the first one. Amicis spectantibus, actor magna voce loquitur. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put down the word when. Now I could put down while, which is always a safe option when the present participle is used, but when is a safe option in fact for any ablative absolute. So when or while, but when I'm putting down here. Now we should then translate the noun or the pronoun, and after that the participle in the ablative absolute. So the noun or the pronoun this time is amicis, when the friends, that's plural, so put the friends. And then we have spectantibus, which literally means watching. Well, clearly I can't say when the friends watching. I need to say either when the friends are watching or when the friends were watching. Well, which is it to be? I get my clue from the tense of the main verb in the sentence. The main verb is loquitur, and loquitur is present. So if I'm going to finish the sentence by saying the actor speaks in the present tense, then I must make my ablative absolute a present tense too. When the friends are watching, and then I'm going to finish the sentence with the actor speaks. And here I've used the words magna voce in Latin, which literally means in a big voice. But I'll say in a loud voice because it's better English. I could even say the actor speaks loudly. Choose one of those two if you're in an exam. Don't hedge your bets and put a slash there as I've done. But you can write either in a loud voice or loudly. So the ablative absolute here describes an action that is taking place at the same time as the main verb of the sentence here. And we know that because the present participle is used. Now let's move on to the second example. Well, again, the ablative absolute comes at the beginning of the sentence, and we have to do the noun first, followed by the participle hortante next. We know that because the present participle hortante is used, the action takes place, the action of the ablative absolute here takes place at the same time as the main verb of the sentence here. This main verb of the sentence is perfect. So let's now translate the whole sentence. Well, I'm going to start with when. Again, I could use while or as, but when is what I'm going to use here. The noun first, legatus, which is the noun that legato is the ablative of. Legatus means a commander or an envoy or an ambassador. I will say when the commander. And then hortante means encouraging. Well, the main tense of this sentence is in the past, So instead of saying is encouraging, I'll go for when the commander was encouraging. And then I'm going to finish the sentence with the last three words. The soldiers attacked the camp. Now, there are alternative ways of translating this. You could translate these ablative absolutes with the word with and say, with the friends watching for the first one, or with the commander encouraging for the second. But we advise you not to do that. Examiners don't really like it. They prefer a when clause, or, as I say, as or while. And remember, for the present participle, while is always a safe option. But if the ablative absolute uses a PPP, then the action in the ablative absolute is over and done with and out of the way before the main clause started. This actually is the most commonly used, most commonly found in Latin literature, so we need to be really on top of this one. So once again, we will take the noun before we take the participle, and looking at the phrase as a whole, we'll just check the tense of the main verb. Well, here the tense of the main verb is perfect. It means he cried. The old man cried. Now we need to translate the ablative absolute, something which is over and done with before the old man cried. So let's say when. It's always our fail-safe start word for an ablative absolute. When the noun, that means the letter, doesn't it? So when the letter. Now PPP of lecta means having been read. Well, I'm certainly not going to say that for my translation, when the letter having been read, but I'll say when the letter was read, or I could say had been read. I quite like that as an alternative. It makes it really clear that the reading was over and done with before the action of the main action of the sentence. When the letter had been read, let's finish it off, the old man cried. It's quite sad. Maybe he cried with joy. Let's have a look at the next example then. I put 3 words in this ablative absolute just to spice it up a little bit. So instead of just saying verbis dictis, I said his verbis dictis. Well, why not? Let's take his and verbis together and dictis afterwards. The main tense of the verb is perfect. So once again, I've got an ablative absolute that has taken place before a verb in the perfect tense. So it's another time I'm probably going to say when something was done or when something had been done. Well, his verbis means these words. Let's get our when down first. And these words and dictis had been said. The messenger departed. Now at this point you might think, well, let's tidy up the English a bit and make it even better. And I could say, having said these words, comes to the same thing. What you want to avoid doing, though, is translating these ablative absolutes with the word with. I know it's tempting, because the ablative, after all, that's, by the way, is a cross, not an X. The ablative is, after all, a case which we translate often as with. But with these words said, the emperor departed, isn't great English. You might think it's okay, but I tell you what, examiners don't tend to like it. And as you were doing this in preparation for an exam, let's avoid saying with. Let's stick with when instead. Let's move on to the last one. Now this is harder than the other two. It's very definitely an A-level type of ablative absolute rather than a GCSE. So I'll just put AL in brackets. If you are studying this video for GCSE, you could watch it anyway and learn something new, or if you prefer, you can just skip on to the next part. The reason why this is harder is that I've used a present subjunctive for our main verb. So redeamus means let us go back or let us return. And because my main verb is in the present, then that's going to have an effect on how I translate the ablative absolute. So I'm still going to say when to start off with, because that's a good way to start. But when the opere, operus means work, doing that one first. When the work, conficio means I finish, so has been finished. Notice I'm saying has been finished, not had been finished, for reasons which should become clear in a minute. Now, present subjunctive, let us return, and finally domum, home. Now, do you see that because the end of it means let us return home, it would be very odd to translate this as when the work had been finished, or when the work was finished, let us return home. That just wouldn't work. So we'll use has been so that the whole sentence makes sense as a whole. When the work has been finished, let us return home. But the principle of all these is the same, which is that whatever happens in the ablative absolute clause is over and done with before you get on to the main part of the sentence. Now here are a few examples of ablative absolutes which use a perfect active participle. Now the number of verbs which have PAPs, perfect active participles, is quite limited. Only deponent verbs have got them. So deponent verb has got a past participle like any verb, but whereas normal verbs have perfect passive participles, deponent verbs will have active ones instead. So let's see a couple of examples using a perfect active participle in the ablative absolute. And here is our first example. We're beginning with euvene locuto. We check the tense, the main verb, erant, which is in the past. So let's get translating. I'm going to start with when, because we always do. Then the noun, the young man. And locutus means having spoken. Turn it into a main verb, and we'll write had spoken. I could just say spoke, but had spoken makes it clearer to the reader. So frankly, it's a better translation. And then to finish the sentence, everyone was angry. I suppose I could say all were angry. That means the same. Last example, we'll just check the main verb, habebant, well that's past tense, so the whole sentence is in the past. We'll begin with a when, because we do. We take the noun first, the leaders, this is an ablative plural. Agressis, had gone out. And the leaders had gone out. Now the main part of the sentence. The soldiers. I can say happy with had. You might want to say were having, but it's not quite such good English. But both of these are correct. A conversation. And if you didn't know the word sermonis means a conversation or a talk. Think of the English word sermon, for example. Inter se, among themselves. Now I just included one example here with a future participle because, to be honest, I think the use of the future participle in an ablative absolute is really rare. But let's throw one in for completion anyway. Here is our future participle, oppugnaturis. You see that telltale UR in between the stem and the ending? If you see that combination, you know you've got a future participle. So our main verb, we'll just check that's in the past. So we need to reflect that in our translation. Let's start with a when, again. Noun first, the enemy. Turn this participle into a main verb. as future, so we're going to say we're about to attack. I could have said we're going to attack. And then the citizens were, magnopera means greatly, I'm going to say very afraid. Good, now you might remember at the beginning I gave you a few examples, and one of the examples I gave you was a little different to the others because it didn't have a participle at all. It had a pronoun and a noun. Now, just occasionally you find an ablative absolute which either uses two nouns or one pronoun and a noun. And actually they're fairly limited in vocabulary. Most common words used in this sort of ablative absolute is the word dux, which means leader, or imperator, which, as you know, means emperor or general. So let's see how these should be translated. Caesare duce, there is your ablative absolute. And I could say with Caesar as leader. Okay, literally with Caesar leader. But I need an as to make it make some sense. I could say when Caesar was leader, while Caesar was leader, but with Caesar as leader we'll do here. And to finish that sentence, the Romans won many wars. Many wars. Taking exactly the same approach for the next one, with Augustus as emperor. Imperator can be emperor or general, but since Augustus was indeed an emperor, that's the most sensible translation here. Romae means at Rome, pax erat, there was peace. And finally, me duce, with me as leader. Again, if you prefer a when clause, you can say when I am your leader. But with me as leader is fine. You will be safe. Now, I know I said to you before that you should try to avoid translating ablative absolutes with the word with, because examiners don't like it, but actually they're fine with it with this sort of ablative absolute. So to summarise, there are three things you need to know about the ablative absolutes. One is that they include at least two words, one of which will usually be a noun, the other will usually be a participle. And both those words will be in the ablative case, which means that if they are singular, they will end with a vowel, could be any vowel, A-E-I-O-U. If they're plural, they will end in S, most likely is or ibus endings. Secondly, when you translate them, it's best to use a when clause in English. Now sometimes while will do, or as, or since. But when is a safe bet. And thirdly, that they are absolute, that is, they're cut off grammatically from the rest of the sentence. The words in the ablative absolute construction don't play a part in the main clause, and that's why we use the word absolute. Now, before we finish, we're going to try some more complicated sentences. And this is particularly important if you're an A-level student. But in fact, even at GCSE, some of the ablative absolute sentences are more complex. That means that they won't necessarily be at the beginning of a sentence. They won't necessarily be cut off from the rest of the sentence with a comma. And sometimes there will be more than two words in the ablative absolute phrase. So let's now take a moment to find the ablative absolute in each of these sentences. Remember, we're looking for two words which are both in the ablative case, usually a noun and a participle. Well, in the first sentence, we have hostibus and expugnantibus. In the second, it's matre and dormiente. In the third, There are 3 words to pick out: plurimus, navibus, and armisis. So our ablative absolute is right in the middle of the sentence. And in the last one, it's captivis and petentibus. So let's now do some translation. Remember that each time we want to begin with the word when, or possibly while or as. Then we're going to go in, first of all, with the noun in the ablative case, and secondly, the participle. The first one is when the enemy, just having a quick look ahead just to find that the main verb is past, so I'm going to say were storming. If the main verb had been present, I'd say when the enemy are storming. Storming means attacking the city for 10 years. And that's these words here. Since they are in between the 2 words of the ablative absolute, it makes a lot of sense to translate them at the same time as the ablative absolute. And I'm going to put my comma in. And now the main clause, the citizens were suffering gravely. Patie bantur means they were suffering, it's a deponent verb, and graviter means gravely. Let's look at the next. Again, we're going to start with when. And I found the ablative absolute at the end of the sentence this time. We can translate it at the end as the Latin's done, or we can do it at the beginning. I'm going to choose to do it at the beginning. So when the matre, the noun first, which is a mother, dormiente, that means sleeping. Well, our main verb is past, so we'll say was sleeping. And then we're going to do the words which belong with those. So we're going to do in cubiculo, in the bedroom. And then we need to do the main clause, which is the girl was writing a letter. Now I could turn that round in English and follow the word order of the Latin. I could say, for example, the girl was writing a letter while or when the mother was sleeping in the bedroom, and that would be absolutely fine. Number 3. So here we've got a noun and an adjective together, and then we've got our participle. We're going to take the noun and the adjective first, and they mean very many ships, armisis, literally having been lost. So let's translate this as a when clause. When very many ships were lost. And then the words in tempestate, which belong in the middle of these 2, go together, and they mean in a storm. And then what we have to do is all the words we haven't yet done. So that's dux and classis, which means the leader of the fleet. And finally, deus precatus est. Well, precatus est is a deponent verb meaning he prayed to, and deus is its object. So the leader of the fleet, sorry, there should be no comma there, prayed to the gods. Last one. Well, our noun in the ablative absolute is captivis, and our participle is petentibus. It's a present participle, but the main verb is past, so I'll say when the prisoners. The verb petere has got so many meanings, but I'm going to here translate it as we're asking for, because that makes good sense. Let's look at the words which come between them first, and we get help from the guard. Auxilium is help from the guard, and that leaves us with the main clause, which is the thief escaped from the prison. A carcere, from the prison. And that is it.